The notary's office smelled of polished wood and faint ink, the air heavy with the faint warmth of late afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. My daughter's voice cut across the room, calm but deliberate. "I won't understand the contract," she said, looking at her husband as though the words alone could redirect the authority in the room. I froze mid-step, my hand resting on the edge of the table, noticing how her tone carried subtle command even in that brief moment. The notary glanced at her first, his pen poised, and for an instant I felt the weight of exclusion settle over me. This was not a casual remark. It was a declaration that my judgment was being dismissed. I shifted slightly, keeping my hands visible on the table, and felt a quiet tightening in my chest. There was no sudden fear, only a cold awareness that something had shifted in the room. The papers before me, drafts, annotations, and preliminary notes, suddenly seemed to carry more than routine legal weight. My daughter's insistence, paired with the notary's hesitant glance, suggested that decisions about my affairs were being subtly redirected before they were even discussed. It was a manipulation wrapped in civility, and the clarity of it pressed against my mind with steady force. My son-in-law nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible motion of agreement, as though he had rehearsed this moment. His eyes flicked to me briefly, then back to the papers, a measured compliance that made me realize the dynamic had shifted entirely. The control was no longer abstract. It had taken form in words, gestures, and authority aligned against my perspective. I could feel the calculated orchestration in the room, a daughter steering the process, a husband reinforcing the position, and a notary, however unknowingly, acquiescing first to her direction. I leaned over slightly, examining the documents in detail. The clauses seemed standard, the legal language precise, yet every page bore a subtle edge I hadn't noticed before. Margins shifted, notes were inserted in places I had not authorized, and headings appeared that emphasized decisions I had never agreed to. The room's quiet was deceptive. Each minor alteration represented a potential erosion of control over my own property and legal rights. The realization did not ignite panic, it sharpened my focus. I had to observe, document, and understand exactly how far this had gone. The notary shifted in his seat, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the documents, still looking briefly toward my daughter. I could sense the weight of her presence guiding his attention, and it struck me how deliberate the arrangement was. By framing me as unable to comprehend, she had claimed an early advantage. That subtle positioning, invisible to casual observation, was the moment I understood the true stakes. The danger wasn't overt confrontation, it was quiet exclusion, manipulation, and alignment of authority against my input. I set my palms flat on the table and let my gaze move from the papers to my daughter's face. There was a calm certainty in her expression, the kind that comes from long practice in steering conversations and outcomes. My son-in-law, equally composed, offered no correction, reinforcing the pattern. I took a slow, measured breath, recognizing that this was a moment where observation alone would not suffice. I had to track every gesture, every word, and every alteration if I hoped to preserve my agency. The office felt smaller, each sound amplified, the scratch of pen on paper, the soft shuffle of pages, the hum of the ventilation. Even the sunlight seemed weighted, casting lines across the table that divided the evidence from my comprehension. Every sensory detail anchored me in the room, reinforcing both the threat and the need for deliberate response. The manipulation was procedural, almost clinical, but its effect was unmistakable. My perspective had been deliberately sidelined. I exhaled quietly, letting my awareness settle. The papers, the positioning, the whispered authority, none of it was accidental. The control being exercised over my legal affairs was immediate, precise, and personal. I could not confront yet, but I could observe, record, and prepare. The danger had been declared. I had been excluded from the beginning, and I would not allow it to continue unnoticed. Moving into the house for the weekend of the contract signing had felt practical at the time. My presence was meant to be a formality, a witness to decisions I had every right to make. But from the moment I arrived, I sensed a subtle tension threading through the rooms. My daughter's tone was clipped, her sentences measured and purposeful, each word chosen to steer the flow of conversation. Even in casual remarks, there was a weight that pressed against my awareness, a quiet assertion of authority I hadn't anticipated. My son-in-law hovered near her side, offering nods and soft confirmations that seemed almost automatic. He never interrupted, never questioned, but the way he mirrored her posture and phrasing told me he was complicit in maintaining the appearance she wanted. The subtle coordination was unsettling. It made the room feel smaller, the documents heavier, and my own voice more easily dismissed. I noticed how my opinions were acknowledged only briefly before being redirected or reframed by her careful wording. Past incidents that had seemed minor began to resurface with new significance. A comment about my hesitancy to review paperwork suddenly felt pointed. A previous suggestion for me to defer decisions was no longer innocuous. Small favors or delays that once appeared to be oversights now seemed like deliberate moves designed to manipulate my perception. Each recollection layered over the current moment, creating a pattern that hinted at planning rather than carelessness. Even the physical spaces conveyed control. The chairs were arranged to keep me slightly off center from the table, documents positioned so I would have to reach across others to view them fully. Every small detail, once invisible or irrelevant, now registered as a subtle orchestration of my perspective. The combination of posture, tone, and placement carried a quiet power that was difficult to confront directly but impossible to ignore. I watched my daughter as she gestured toward the notary, her eyes never leaving the papers long enough to meet mine. There was a precision to her actions, a rehearsed confidence that I had not fully appreciated before. My son-in-law's quiet compliance amplified the effect. Together they created an environment where my presence mattered in theory, but influence was effectively removed. The subtle intimidation worked in layers, each move measured and synchronized. I felt a slow tightening in my awareness, a low hum of vigilance that demanded attention. The house, the office, even the controlled gestures of my family became a stage on which I had to navigate carefully. The minor inconsistencies in conversation, timing, and behavior were no longer random. They were signals indicating that someone else was orchestrating outcomes and testing my reactions. Sitting quietly for a moment, I realized the unease was deliberate. Every interaction carried a dual purpose: outwardly normal, inwardly guiding the narrative away from my comprehension. The control was not overt, not violent, but it was clear. The environment was being manipulated subtly, consistently, and with intent. I straightened in my chair and surveyed the room again, noting the alignment of people, documents, and gestures. The implications were clear: trust could not be assumed here, and attention to detail would be essential. The quiet authority and coordination around me had revealed the first true shadow of intent, and I understood that observation alone was now a critical defense. I noticed immediately how my daughter guided the notary's attention, shifting the conversation away from certain clauses and toward sections that seemed innocuous but subtly favored her and her husband. Her hands moved with purpose over the papers, pointing, tapping, and rearranging pages so the focus remained on her framing. Each adjustment was quiet, almost imperceptible yet deliberate, small motions that redirected authority without raising alarms. I felt a tightening in my chest, a measured awareness that this was no casual oversight. As the discussion progressed, contradictions between what had been verbally promised and what the documents contained became apparent. A clause my daughter had described as simple and standard appeared with additional language I hadn't agreed to, altering obligations and benefits in ways I hadn't anticipated. The notary, still attentive to her cues, overlooked the subtleties that I now perceived, and the gap between spoken assurances and printed reality sent a cold ripple through my awareness. I began flipping through the papers with steady fingers, noting missing pages and delayed insertions that hadn't been present in the preliminary drafts. Some sections had ambiguous wording, phrases that seemed designed to mislead or obscure intent. Each omission or alteration carried the quiet precision of premeditation. They were minor enough to escape casual notice but significant enough to change the outcome. I recognized the pattern growing clear across multiple documents. From across the table, my daughter's gestures and her husband's muted nods appeared synchronized, a quiet rehearsal of alignment. It was almost imperceptible how they coordinated their narrative. She would present an idea, and he would affirm it in measured agreement, reinforcing the impression that the documents were uncontroversial and mutually understood. The choreography was deliberate, a silent manipulation of perception that left me questioning which details were genuine and which had been rehearsed to control the process. I paused to consider the subtle cues in their behavior. The way she interrupted the notary's questions when they wandered toward clauses that might disadvantage her, the way her husband deferred with a glance or nod rather than interjecting. Each interaction was measured, precise, and layered with intent. The environment of trust and routine I had relied upon now felt like a stage where my comprehension was being tested, guided, and restrained. The tension in the room mounted, though no one raised their voice. I felt it in the weight of the papers, in the precise placement of their hands, and in the faint, almost imperceptible glances toward one another. Every small interference suggested forethought. Each contradiction between what had been promised and what was presented confirmed that oversight alone could not explain the discrepancies. I realized then that the stakes were not hypothetical. The documents before me were crafted to shape outcomes without my input, and the subtle orchestration of attention and authority around me ensured that my influence was minimized. This was planning, not accident, and it demanded vigilance, observation, and strategic response. The quiet control, the subtle manipulations, and the orchestrated alignment between daughter and husband left no room for doubt. The contract was being shaped against me, and understanding it was only the first step toward reclaiming agency. I pulled the folder closer, laying out the drafts, notarized copies, and correspondence in a careful sequence across the table. Each page carried a weight I hadn't fully grasped until now, the subtle differences between versions becoming impossible to ignore. Margins shifted slightly, dates were inserted in inconsistent order, and certain clauses appeared altered or omitted entirely. The changes were small, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest deliberate intervention. I traced the lines with my finger, cataloging each deviation, noting the implications quietly in my mind. I compared these copies to the standard protocols I had learned over years of reviewing contracts in my own career. The discrepancies jumped out in sharp relief. Clauses that should have required explicit consent were pre-signed, deadlines were manipulated, and procedural notes from the notary seemed to omit essential formalities. Each inconsistency reinforced the idea that someone had carefully guided the process to achieve a specific outcome. Nothing had been accidental. Across the room, my daughter shifted in her seat, subtly adjusting her papers and glancing at her husband. Their movements were synchronized, restrained, but precise, a quiet choreography that mirrored the manipulations on the page. I observed the micro-expressions, the brief tightening of her jaw, the slight lift of an eyebrow when I scrutinized a particular clause, his careful nods reinforcing her framing. The behaviors were invisible to anyone not watching closely, but they confirmed my suspicion that oversight alone could not explain the patterns. I cross-referenced the notarized versions with emails and letters exchanged over the past months. Deadlines had been subtly shifted, prior approvals appeared to contradict later versions, and annotations in the margins indicated changes without my acknowledgement. The cumulative effect painted a clear picture. The contract had been quietly steered, each alteration deliberate, each omission strategic. The past minor inconsistencies now formed a coherent trail pointing toward calculated intent. I reached for my phone and began documenting methodically. Photos captured page alignments, highlights marked discrepancies, and a time-stamped record was created to track the review process. Notes in a small leather-bound journal recorded observations about both the documents and the subtle cues from my daughter and son-in-law. Each step was careful, methodical, a defensive measure as much as a record. Even the notary's procedural manner was revealing in retrospect. Questions were deflected, points of clarification minimized, and certain sections were expedited as though pre-approved by an unseen hand. I noted these actions with precision, understanding that patterns of behavior were as important as the documents themselves. The combination of altered pages, missing clauses, and coordinated oversight left no room for error. The manipulation was real, systematic, and deliberate. I leaned back for a moment, letting the quiet of the office settle around me. Each observation, each cross-reference, and each recorded detail strengthened the clarity of the situation. The evidence was now tangible, organized, and undeniable. I could see the contours of control with cold precision, the orchestration laid bare across both paper and behavior. The manipulation was no longer abstract, it was concrete, and every step I took in documenting it brought me closer to understanding the full extent of their intent. I noticed the first irregularity when I slid two drafts side by side, aligning them by the edges. A clause that had once protected my decision-making authority was replaced with a vague statement shifting control toward a designated family representative. The wording was softened, almost polite, but its meaning was sharp enough to cut. My pulse tightened as I traced the new phrasing. It favored my daughter and her husband completely. Nothing about the change felt accidental. I reached for another document, the version I distinctly remembered reviewing last month. The line where my initials should have been was filled, but the handwriting wasn't mine. The curve of the letters, the pressure on the page, even the slight slant leaning forward. None of it matched my own. A forged set of initials sat there, calm and quiet, pretending to be me. The air felt heavier as I stared at it, a cold pressure settling behind my ribs. I flipped further into the stack, looking for clarity and instead finding more inconsistencies. A signature block carried my name printed beneath it, but the signature itself differed in style, as if someone had tried to imitate me but grew impatient halfway through. Lines wavered where mine would have been firm. A loop in the last letter curled in a direction I never use. The realization hit sharply. These weren't editing errors. They were deliberate insertions made with the confidence that I wouldn't look closely. I leaned closer and examined the notary's seal placement. One stamp overlapped a section that was never present in the original draft I saw. Another had a date that predated my meeting by nearly a week. These weren't oversights in paperwork. They were signs of someone manipulating the timeline, shifting approvals without my presence or consent. This was no longer a suspicion or a feeling. It was proof. As I continued through the amendments, I saw entire paragraphs rewritten with language that subtly redirected control of my property, my accounts, and my decisions. Terms like temporary authority had become extended authority. Statements marked as advisory only were now labeled as binding. Each change pulled something away from me and handed it to them. My daughter's calm insistence that this was routine echoed in my mind, now reframed as something practiced, rehearsed. A surge of betrayal tightened my chest. My own child had presented these documents as harmless updates, small adjustments meant to simplify things. Now I could see how carefully those adjustments had been planted. Each change was a step toward limiting my rights, shifting ownership, and erasing my role in decisions that belonged to me alone. The danger wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, precise, and calculated. The final blow came when I uncovered a page that had been entirely replaced. The original paragraph, which protected my ability to revoke the agreement at any time, was gone. In its place stood a clause requiring joint consent, hers and mine, to amend or nullify the contract. That clause alone could trap me. That clause alone could end everything I had worked for. The weight of the discovery settled into a hard, cold certainty. The manipulation wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. It was targeted, planned, executed with the assumption I wouldn't catch it until it was too late. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about control of me, my choices, my future. The notary invited me back into her office the next morning, her tone steady but different, more formal than before. She set the folder between us and opened it with careful hands, as if the documents inside were already evidence. I watched her scan the pages I had marked, her eyes narrowing at each altered line. The room felt smaller with every silent second that passed. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "These changes weren't part of what you signed," she said, "and they weren't approved through any proper process." Her words didn't rise or fall. They landed plainly, without softness. I felt a chill move through my shoulders, not from surprise, but from having my suspicions confirmed by someone who understood the technical lines far better than I did. She pulled out the scanned originals from her server, flipping through timestamped copies. Each version carried a digital signature and an unbroken chain of custody, clean, verifiable, untouched. Then she held up the versions I brought. The format was identical, but the content wasn't. "These sections were inserted," she continued, "here, here, and here. They were added after the notarization, which is illegal." Hearing the word illegal felt like a wall closing around the situation. She turned to her monitor and pulled up the log history. The timestamps were clear. Someone accessed the documents outside authorized hours. The edits were made under a guest login, not an administrator account. That alone suggested someone had bypassed normal procedure. The notary kept her tone neutral, but her silence between explanations said more than the words themselves. She walked me through each alteration with clinical precision, showing me how the dates didn't match, how certain digital signatures had been removed, and how others had been overwritten. My pulse tightened as I watched the differences appear side by side. The clean version in her archive protected my rights, my choices, and the property I intended to manage carefully after my health scare. The altered version shifted everything. It cut my authority, redirected decision-making, and locked me behind clauses that benefited only one direction, theirs. Seeing it laid out like this stripped away any remaining doubt. This wasn't sloppy paperwork. It was a deliberate attempt to slide control out from under me. The notary took a measured breath before closing the folder. "You're at risk if you sign anything else without independent counsel," she said, no alarm in her tone, no judgment, just the plain truth. She handed me copies of the original logs, the access history, and the certified version of the contract. Each document felt heavier than its physical weight as I placed it into my bag. A quiet tension filled my chest as the reality settled in. My daughter wasn't just pushing, she was maneuvering. All those subtle gestures, the rushed explanations, the controlled environment, the way she hovered during the meeting, now aligned into a pattern I could no longer ignore. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was strategy. As I rose to leave, the notary added one final line, steady and simple. "You need to protect yourself immediately." It wasn't a dramatic warning. It was a procedural fact delivered by someone who had seen enough cases to know when one was unfolding. Stepping out of her office, I felt the air colder than before. Now I understood the real threat, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer to defend myself. I spread the folder open on the study desk, arranging every document with meticulous care: contract drafts, amended pages, notarized logs, and the photos I had taken of altered clauses. Each sheet represented a thread of manipulation I had traced back to deliberate action. As I reviewed them one by one, my daughter entered the room, pausing mid-step when she noticed the neat layout. Her eyes flicked briefly over the pages, and a subtle tightening around her mouth revealed she had sensed the scrutiny. There was no overt anger, but the shift in her posture carried a quiet, controlled hostility. My son-in-law lingered near the doorway, hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, yet the slight hesitation in his stance suggested internal conflict. He had been compliant, yes, but now I could see the tension between loyalty to his wife and acknowledgement of my presence in the investigation. Their combined dynamic was careful, precise, and quietly adversarial. Each glance, each micro-movement, signaled awareness of my growing awareness of their orchestration. I began preparing for a possible confrontation. I gathered the phone, making sure it was charged and accessible. Legal counsel contact information was placed in a folder at the top of my bag, and a small set of documents detailing timelines, evidence, and notarized confirmations was arranged for easy reference. A plan for a controlled exit was drafted in my mind. A route to the car, keys within reach, and a secure space nearby should the discussion escalate. Each step was procedural, deliberate, and silent. A minor verbal clash occurred as my daughter gestured toward the papers I had spread out. "Why are these all here?" she asked sharply, her voice steady but pointed. I answered calmly, noting the date stamps and photographic evidence, and her expression tightened further. She did not raise her voice beyond the level of curiosity, but the tension was palpable, a test of boundaries, a probe to gauge how much I had realized. It confirmed the environment was now adversarial and subtle provocations were likely to continue. I revisited each document again, checking margins, signatures, and alterations. Every note, every timestamp, every inserted clause was cross-referenced with prior drafts and the notary's original files. Observation became the tool of both defense and preparation. I knew the confrontation would require clarity, focus, and restraint. Any misstep could allow the subtle manipulations to continue or be reframed as misunderstanding. The room felt smaller with each movement, the weight of paper, the positioning of chairs, the proximity of the daughter and son-in-law, all emphasized the psychological landscape I now navigated. I allowed myself a moment to map out their potential reactions, predicting how each subtle gesture might serve to intimidate, redirect, or deflect. My mental preparation was as important as the physical arrangement of evidence. Finally, I closed the folder, leaving the documents neatly stacked on the desk. I straightened my posture, took a steady breath, and anchored my awareness on the purpose ahead. This confrontation was inevitable. The evidence, the authority, and my own vigilance had brought me to this point. I felt the full weight of the stakes, and with it came a quiet but firm courage. Every movement, every word, every glance would now matter, and I was ready to meet them with clarity and resolve. I placed the folder firmly on the conference table, opening it to display every page in sequence. My daughter and son-in-law stood across from me, the notary seated beside them, and the independent witness from the attorney's office positioned at the far end. I met my daughter's gaze and spoke evenly, each word deliberate. These documents, I said, tapping the top sheet, show intentional alterations, additions, and omissions. They are time-stamped, notarized, and verifiable. Every change benefits you and your husband at my expense. Her composure faltered just slightly, a micro-expression that vanished when she pressed her hands together. I don't know what you mean, she said quickly, glancing at her husband. I followed the drafts I was given. If there's a discrepancy, it's a mistake, nothing intentional. The calm of her words failed to mask the tension radiating from her posture. Her husband's eyes darted between the folder and the notary, uncertain, voice low. Maybe a clerk adjusted something, he offered, tentative and rehearsed, as though the explanation alone could erase the evidence. I reached for the printed logs and the annotated copies from the notary's archive, placing them next to the folder. These show the exact sequence of edits, the inserted clauses, and the forged initials, I said. They were applied after notarization without my knowledge or consent. This isn't error, it's deliberate. The witness leaned forward, examining the timestamps and digital copies. The weight of the procedural confirmation made the room colder, heavier. Truth, unemotional and precise, now dominated the space. The notary's gaze sharpened as she reviewed the alignment of signatures, stamps, and dates. The modifications are inconsistent with standard practice, she said clearly, pointing to the altered pages. They constitute deliberate manipulation. Any claim of oversight is invalid. This is procedural misconduct. The words landed without flourish, but their impact reverberated through the room. My daughter's face paled and her husband's jaw tightened. They were cornered by facts, not accusations. I let the silence stretch, allowing the evidence to speak. The alignment between daughter and husband, the selective guidance of my attention, and the precise alterations of documents had all been intended to mislead me. Their micro-behaviors, which once seemed subtle or unremarkable, now fell into place as an orchestrated pattern. The realization of complicity and intent pressed against the walls like a physical weight, undeniable and complete. My daughter opened her mouth, then closed it. My son-in-law shifted uneasily. Neither could produce a response that reconciled their words with the documents before them. The witness and notary observed quietly, confirming with calm clarity that the changes were intentional. The atmosphere became taut, almost tangible, each second expanding the gravity of the truth. I leaned forward slightly, placing my hands flat on the table. I trusted both of you, I said. I expected transparency, but what I see is manipulation, deliberate and premeditated. The documents, the timing, the coordination, it's all clear now. There is no misunderstanding here. The room fell silent. The truth was laid bare, and no deflection, hesitation, or explanation could undo it. The moment settled heavy in the air, betrayal confirmed, control exposed, and the stakes of my agency made absolute. The confrontation was complete in its clarity. The evidence had spoken. The deception could no longer be denied, and the full weight of their manipulation now rested in plain view. The next morning, the attorney arrived with a stack of official documents, each bearing the letterhead of the regulatory board and detailed logs of the notarized contract. I watched as the papers were carefully laid across the desk, their crisp edges and precise language signaling finality. Each entry confirmed what I already suspected: the alterations, omissions, and inserted clauses had been recognized as deliberate and improper. The classification was clear: intentional manipulation of legal documents affecting my rights. There was no room for ambiguity or dismissal. My daughter and son-in-law were informed formally that their authority over the contract and any related financial decisions was revoked pending review. Oversight measures were put into place immediately. A designated attorney would now handle all future amendments, and notarizations would be verified independently. The procedural enforcement was quiet and precise, yet its effect was undeniable. Their ability to influence or control outcomes had been curtailed. The room felt heavy with the authority of law acting without fanfare but with unmistakable impact. I observed my son-in-law shifting in his chair, his eyes lowered, the tightness around his mouth betraying a mix of guilt and disbelief. My daughter remained still, her hands resting rigidly in her lap, but I could sense the tension in her shoulders, the careful avoidance of eye contact. Neither could dispute the evidence now. The formal recognition of their misconduct removed any room for denial. The air in the office was taut with understanding. The consequences were concrete, procedural, and absolute. The attorney handed me a folder containing copies of all filings, confirmations from the notary, and annotations detailing the enforced oversight. I methodically reviewed each page, verifying the protective measures in place. The clarity of the documentation offered a measured comfort. I wasn't relying on goodwill or trust. The procedures themselves now ensured that future interactions could not be manipulated in the same manner. The protection was structural, precise, and unemotional, which made it far more reliable than any personal assurance. I packed the folder carefully, placing it into my bag with deliberate care, and prepared for temporary relocation to a monitored environment provided by the regulatory body. The space was secure, designed to allow me to maintain independence without exposure to further manipulation. The transition was quiet and deliberate, without drama, but it marked a profound shift. I had removed myself from the sphere of influence that had quietly exerted control over my affairs. Sitting in the new space, I let the sequence of events settle in my mind. Each alteration, each subtle misdirection, and each coordinated act of influence had now been formally recognized and corrected. I did not feel triumphant or relieved. Instead, there was a sober awareness of the betrayal I had endured, and the procedural mechanisms that had restored order. The gravity of manipulation and its consequences weighed heavily, but the clarity of official oversight brought a precise, unemotional form of closure. The house, the office, and the orchestrated authority that had sought to subvert my decisions were now neutralized. Their power had been formally removed, and the rules were enforced. I could proceed without fear of further unseen interference, relying on structure, documentation, and procedural verification rather than trust alone. The deception had been cataloged, the authority curtailed, and justice applied. The manipulation could no longer extend its reach, and I could finally begin to navigate the path forward with vigilance, clarity, and measured control.